Welcome everyone to Zoom into Books this afternoon. We have award-winning author Robert Genetski. He is the author of a book titled Is There Evidence for God? He is also an economist who has written 5 books. He has spent more than 50 years researching complex economic issues and decided to embark on his most ambitious project ever, the search for evidence of God. Welcome, Robert, to Zoom into Books.
Thank you, Kathy. Great to be here, and thanks for doing this.
Absolutely. And another thing that you may not know, Robert was with us in Chicago, Illinois for the American Library Association National Conference just a couple weeks ago. That was held at McCormick Place, and we had a good time, didn't we, Robert?
We sure did.
It was huge. The librarians and educators came to our booth. We were busy the whole time. They loved meeting the new authors. So, Robert, let's start out today. This is a most unusual title for a book, and I would like for you to start out, please, by telling us what made you feel compelled to write this book.
I guess like an awful lot of people, I've always wondered about God and religion. I mean, I was told about him by my parents, but that was about the extent of it. And it was something I always wanted to do in my life. I wanted to say, gee, let me look into these questions about God. Let me look into the questions about religion and stuff like that. It was always something on the back burner that I never had time for. And I think what shook me up, it was about 13 years ago. My 90-year-old mom was talking to me, and she said, Bobby, you know, your mom always calls you Bobby. I don't think there really is a God. I don't think he's real, and I don't think there's anything after I die. Now, this was a person who told me about God, and I was stunned. Apparently, one of her neighbors had told her that God was simply something invented for weak-minded people to help them get through life. And that might have been the first challenge she ever had to her life and to her beliefs. And she didn't know how to deal with it, and I wasn't much help. I mean, what was I going to say? Hey, you were the one who told me. Now you're telling me you don't think he exists. So I think that was a spark that had me say, you know, you always wanted to do this. Your life is getting on. You better do it now, or there may not be any time left. Kathy, I'm not hearing you. Did you put yourself on mute?
I did. Thank you for catching that.
Yeah.
I said that
It helps if I can hear the questions.
Yes, that's certainly good motivation. Absolutely. Who will get the most benefit from reading your book?
You know, my target audience is really people like me, like my mom, who are just, they have questions about God, they have questions about religion, and they haven't had satisfactory answers. People say you just have to believe, or you have to believe because of what I've been told or what I know about God. And so I've tried to really target the audience to anyone who has any curiosity or interest in these questions. And that's my target audience. I have 10 grandchildren, and some of them are reading the book, others just are not readers, and so they haven't started yet. I'm hoping at some point in their life they will get to it, because that's the people I would like to really reach. You know, I believe there is a lot of evidence for God, and we can get into that, but a lot of people are agnostic. They say they just don't know, and that's, of course, I think what a lot of people would say. And I would hope that this book would help them get answers.
Absolutely. I did not get a chance to speak with you at length when we were in Chicago, but I know that you were quite busy talking with people. This is a subject that interests hundreds of thousands of people. So with such a broad and ambitious project, how did you even start to approach this?
Well, I was very fortunate in that I spent most of my career in the area of research. I was a director of research for large corporations. I had my own company where I directed research, and we looked into very complex questions about the economy and financial markets and things like this. So I had a lot of research skills. I had mentored people in the area of research. Now, of course, I didn't have any skills in looking into God or the supernatural or religions because I just hadn't paid any attention there. But I felt that without knowing whether or not it might succeed, I would at least give it my best effort, use whatever skills I had learned in research, and try and come up with some answers about a topic that I really had very little knowledge about.
And with the amount of research you had to do on this book, Robert, how long did it take you to complete the book? And how many times did you think you were finished with it and weren't? I hear that a lot from authors.
I'm still not finished with it, even though the book is out. It's one of those topics that you just keep having to learn more and more about. I mean, there's no end to the amount of knowledge. And it took me a long, long time. And it was a very slow start. I have to say, when people think about God and religion and think about looking into it, the implications for your life can be really very dramatic. For example, I spent a lot of time even before I decided, yes, I definitely will go ahead with it, thinking about, well, what if I find that, the religion that I've been taught isn't the one that seems to have the evidence? What if it's a strange religion that I never even heard of? What if there's no God? What if I find that out? How will that affect the relationship I have with my wife, with my kids, with my family, my friends? The implications are so great. I really wanted to ponder, do I really want to go ahead with this? Because I was concerned. I was committed to whatever I find, that's what I'm going to go with. And that I will answer the questions as best I can. And I really thought perhaps this thing is doable, mainly because if there is a God, I think he'd want us to find him. And if someone's diligently searching, I think that he would open the door to us finding him. And if there isn't a God, I thought, well, I might have a lot more time to play golf on Sunday morning than I would otherwise have.
Right. There'd be a lot of people out there with you. They're either on the golf course or at the church or Walmart. So this is such a broad subject. I mean, I think this is astounding. Please tell us some of the evidence you found, particularly evidence from the Hebrew Bible, with all those wild stories that so many people have trouble believing. Please fill us in on that.
Yeah, let me say first that many of the stories in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, both the same thing, are difficult to believe. In fact, a lot of people say that they don't believe in God because these stories are just so difficult to believe. The Adam and Eve, the flood, Abraham, Moses, the escape from Egypt, the opening of the Red Sea, all of that. People have said, no way could this possibly be true. And to make it even more convincing to those people, when I went in to look at the biblical scholars, the people who have looked deeply into these questions, many of them say there is absolutely no evidence that these events actually happened. Now, if that's true, and if these things didn't happen, it has important implications for all the major religions of the world. For example, Judaism, of course, is based on the Hebrew Bible being correct. Christianity is based on it. That's the precursor to the New Testament. And Islam also is based on the Old Testament. So if these events did not occur, none of these religions stand on any sound foundation, and we should probably do away with all three. Now, what happened? Well, I kept researching, and I looked not only at biblical scholars who believe none of this occurred, I also looked to biblical scholars who were convinced that many of these events did occur. And let me give you a quick rundown of the things that I found so impressive that the Old Testament appeared to me to be inspired by God. First, let's consider the timeline. The Hebrew Bible, according to almost all biblical scholars, was put together probably by a Jewish priest about 600 years before Jesus was born. And the stories that he put together came from as much as 1,000 years before Jesus was born. So we're talking about 1,600 years before Jesus was born, and that's where we get some of these stories. And yet, what we find is that the Hebrew Bible contains over 300 predictions talking about a savior, a Messiah, a son of God, who God would send to the world, not just to save Israel, but to save the entire world. Now, many of these predictions were very specific. They talked about the way the Savior was going to end up dying and giving his life. And it's very, very specific. And it turns out that all those specific things are consistent with what the New Testament tells us about Jesus' life. Now, I'm an economist, okay? So I often will forecast something maybe a year and ahead. And you know how many things can happen in a year and how many things can change in that forecast. Or sometimes I might go out a little longer than a year, but the longer I go out, the less confidence I have in a forecast. So my question is, if things can change in a year, who in their right mind makes predictions 500 years, 1,000 years, 1,500 years into the future? And that's what we see in the Old Testament. And even more incredible, how many of those predictions made over a millennia or more are going to come true? Now, you know, it just appears to me that when you look at the time horizon that we find in the Old Testament, we are not dealing with things that we humans are concerned with. We're not dealing with what happens next week or a month from now, or maybe a year from now, maybe even 5 years from now. We're dealing with things that are beyond our concept of time. And so that was one thing. Now, another thing, there's a story in the Bible about Abraham who talks to God, and whose sons, incidentally, are Isaac and Ishmael. And according to the Bible, they become the heads of the Jewish and Arab people, who are destined to struggle against each other for a long period of time. Now, it turns out that there is DNA evidence that's been taken of Jewish people and Arab people who have pretty consistent strands of DNA. And when they trace that DNA back, it traces back to one father who lived about 3,000 years ago, and that would be Abraham. So here we're having some scientific evidence that comes out. There's also a story in the Bible of the Moses and the Passover and the escape from Egypt, through the Red Sea and things like that. And these events were supposed to have occurred about 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus. And in the New Testament, what we find out is Jesus and his family every year had a tradition of going to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover festival. And not only that, but here we are 2,000 years later, and many Jewish peoples continue to celebrate the Passover festival. And, what sort of an event occurs that has no meaning, that people are still celebrating 3,000 years later? It just seems to me that there are time things here that are very difficult to explain unless they actually occur. And again, one last example. There's more DNA evidence that this period of Moses and Israel and the escape out of Egypt actually occurred. At one point after the Israelis crossed the Red Sea, God tells Moses to set aside Aaron and his children and his descendants as a special priestly caste to perform certain priestly functions. And it turns out that there's DNA evidence that certain Jewish people have a certain gene who has been kept for the past 3,000 years called the Cohen gene, or Cohen. You've heard the name Cohen. And it turns out that some of these people, well, first of all, they've traced these people right back 3,000 years to the time of Moses and Aaron. And even more incredible, some of these people today still are taking part in Jewish ceremonies with this Cohen gene, readings and things like that. So what it seems to have occurred is something that God set up 3,000 years ago still has remnants of being practiced to this day. So those are the examples from the Bible that have convinced me that we're really not dealing with something that's human. We're dealing with something that is out of this world.
It's fascinating when you start getting into scientific evidence, genetic tracings. That's another reason to pick up this book. Robert, where can people buy your book?
Well, Amazon is probably the most convenient place, but you can, if you order it from bookstores, you can request that they order it. You could tell the bookseller that there's guaranteed return if they want to return it and get their money back. That's fine. Take a chance.
Well, this is amazing. So you talked about evidence from the Old Testament. What evidence for God did you find since biblical times?
Oh my gosh, this was really the biggest shock to me, because again, you look for evidence, you hope it's there, and I found so much that it would take hours to talk about it when I know we don't have hours. But let me point out just 3 things that I made a big impression on me, and there are so many others, and I'll just summarize them very quickly. One is something called the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is what many believe is the burial cloth of Jesus, and it is the most scientifically tested relic of all time. I mean, we have well over half a century of scientists who have gone over this burial cloth, and what that confirms is, first of all, the cloth is from the time of Jesus. There's no question about that. There are many, many ways that it's been confirmed. It is also a cloth that contained the body of a real live human man. And when they look at the evidence, this man was tortured terribly. All of the wounds are very consistent with what the Bible tells us Jesus went through, including, it's also interesting because the people who read the New Testament know that at Jesus' tomb, when they couldn't find the body the next day, there was this face cloth along with a burial cloth that were lying in the tomb. And the burial cloth disappeared from the face cloth soon after the time of the resurrection. That face cloth has also been venerated as a relic, but totally separate from the burial cloth. The two were brought together, I think it was in 1971, to do tests on both, just again to see if they match, and they did match up. All the wounds in the head on the face cloth matched those in the burial cloth, which was another confirmation, including the same testing of the blood stains, and had the same characteristic. So that's one. There's another relic also that has been scientifically tested a number of times, and that's, you may have heard of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The relic includes a picture of Our Lady that supposedly appeared to a peasant in Mexico, something like 600 years ago. And when the peasant told the local bishop that the lady had appeared to her and wanted something done, a chapel or something built in her honor. The bishop, of course, denied it and said, no, you have to bring me proof. And the peasant told that to the vision, and the vision of Mary went and told him to put some roses together, put them in his cloak, his tilde, and bring them to the bishop, and he would see the proof. And when the peasant went to the bishop and opened his cloak, what he saw was an image of the Blessed Mother, of Jesus' mother. And the bishop was immediately stunned and convinced. But more important than that, the Aztec Indians, who still had all their pagan rituals at the time, looked at this image and saw so many indications that the true God was Jesus, and it was not the pagan gods that had them sacrificing human sacrifices. And we had the biggest conversion in history in Mexico to Christianity. Absolutely amazing. Now, what's so unique about this? Well, first of all, it's not a painting. I tried to convince, when I went to Mexico and saw the Our Lady of Guadalupe, I tried to convince an artist, not convince him, but I asked him if he had ever seen this, because he was right outside where this relic was being displayed. He said, no, it's an obvious fake, and I don't even have to see it to believe it. Well, it turns out when the scientists look at this, first of all, it's not a painting at all. The figments that make up this miraculous figure are apparently floating above the cactus. And the cactus, which should have deteriorated in 10 years, is still intact in over 600 years. There are so many things I can't talk about. Well, let me talk about just one thing about this Our Lady of Guadalupe. The eyes, which are only like 1/8 of an inch thick, have been examined by ophthalmologists to a tremendous extent, because they have trouble believing that when they look in these eyes, they can see images that confirm the laws of optics that were not discovered until at least 200 years after this image was created. And so, first of all, no one knew enough to paint that detail into the eyes. And there's so many others that convince a lot of scientists, and have convinced me, that this is simply not of this world. Third and final evidence for God that I'll talk about here, and there are many more in the book, is the miracle that occurred at Fatima. And this occurred just a little over a century ago in 1917. Here again, Mary, Jesus' mother, supposedly appeared to 3 young children. Children's ages were 7 to 10. And she appeared in a field in Portugal, in the middle of Portugal, an isolated field, first in May 13th of 1917. And she told them that she would be there every month for the next 6 months to talk to them, explain about heaven and things like that. No one else could hear, but only these children. But each month, more and more people came. And in July of that year, when the children had been terribly mistreated, because everyone told them they were lying, almost everyone told them that. The local priest told them that that was the work of the devil. A lot of religious people criticized them. They were actually arrested at one point, put in jail, taken away from their parents, and threatened that they would be killed if they didn't tell the truth. Well, of course, they felt they were telling the truth, so they had nothing to worry about. And they said, hey, if we die, that's okay, but we're not going to die for lying. In July, the vision told them that in order to have other people believe that what they said was true, there would be a great miracle that would be performed. Oh, by July, there were 70,000 people in this field in the middle of Portugal. And it had rained all night long and all morning. And this miracle was supposed to occur at high noon. And sure enough, just at high noon, all the rain stopped, the whole ground dried up, and the sun started to move from its position in the sky, started to jump around the sky, started to twirl, throwing off colors, different colors that bathed everything in a new color, and then came crashing down to earth And everyone screamed and yelled and said, "It's it, the end of the world." And then after 8 minutes, the sun simply went back to its place in heaven. And that was the miracle. If anyone wants to, and which I've done, go on the internet. There are lots of people, reporters there, skeptics, atheists. They all write and talk about what happened at that time. 70,000 people, exactly at the time that was stated, had these. So these are just a sample of the stories, and there's a lot more detail in the book, where it appears that God is providing some evidence to us that he is real, that he cares about us, and that he wants a relationship with us.
That's an incredible story. It really is. I've heard and read a lot of stories, but I've not heard the end of that story. I'm going to highly recommend everybody read this book. I think there is a Christian movement that's really starting to take hold in America. Those of you who are watching on Facebook, if you have questions for our author, Robert Genetski, please type them in the Facebook comments, and we'll make sure that he answers all your questions before we end the interview here. I have another question, Robert. I know with doing the kind of research you've been doing, you had to have some setbacks and some very discouraging moments and probably roadblocks set up to block some of your research. Can you tell us some of those moments?
Well, the most discouraging of all was when I went into the biblical evidence for the Old Testament. And I found all of these scholars who said there is absolutely not one shred of evidence that any of these events in the Old Testament occurred. What I felt at that point is, if that's true, that not only kills Judaism, it kills Christianity, it kills Islam. All of these people praying to this God of the Old Testament are praying to someone, who really doesn't exist. And I was convinced for, that time that there is no evidence. This is the end of my story. The project is over. I really was. I was ready to congratulate the atheists. Hey, you guys got it right. And it was very depressing, very deep, very dark period in this quest, in this journey that I had. And I thought it was over. It was only, by simply looking and saying, well, I wonder if there are any biblical scholars who have evidence to the contrary, or can, and I kept looking and looking and looking, and sure enough, I found there were, as in every case. You can't rely on experts, because experts will often disagree. I'm convinced there is evidence for just about every view. The one thing the atheists say is there's no evidence for God. And that is, let me say how wrong that is. There is evidence for every view that has any sort of popularity, for anything. The question is not whether there's evidence. The question is, how strong or how weak is the evidence? Is the evidence persuasive enough for me to believe, or is it unpersuasive so that I'm not going to believe? And that's the approach that I took. Some people have said in criticizing the book that, well, you didn't prove that God exists. Well, no, I didn't set out to prove anything. I set out to see, is there evidence, first of all? My answer is, my gosh, I can't believe how much there is. And then, how persuasive is it? And what I can say is it was tremendously persuasive to me. It's changed my whole life, my whole attitude. Someone asked me, well, do you have, without knowing how the book came out, they said, do you now have more time to golf on Sunday morning? I said, actually, it's worked out the opposite. I have a lot less time than I had before, because there's so many things I still want to know and want to learn about God, about evidence. And I think there is still so much more to learn.
And you're not alone there. There are many, many people who do a lot of research, Bible study groups. It's amazing how much research is going on independently, I think really around the world now. These mega churches that have formed now some of them are really good. They're actually preaching the Bible, teaching the Bible, preaching it and teaching.
Yeah.
And I think it's very courageous of you to take on this research. I do know that you won the Literary Titan Award for this book, and I'm sure you're going to win many more. Congratulations on that. Do you think, we have a question here. Do you think being in your 60s when you took on this affected your ability to keep an open mind and welcome your findings? Would it have been different, do you think, if you had done it in your 20s and 30s?
There's no way that I can know. You don't get to go back. But the one thing I will tell you is that when I finished the book, at least finished certainly the basic manuscript, I kind of looked up and said, I wish I had had this when I was younger, like in my 20s. If I had done this in my 20s, what I could see is how much easier my life would have been. How I would have faced different challenges. Yeah, it would have made a big difference in my life. So that's the only thing I think I can say for certain. If I had had this book, and I wish I did, early in my life, and read it and was convinced of all these things that I found in the book, life would have been a lot easier, especially those very, very challenging moments that we all end up having to experience, the death of loved ones, disappointments in terms of jobs or whatever. So many things I would have been more prepared to handle better than I actually did.
I would agree with that, I'm sure. Have your discoveries changed you as a husband, father, and grandfather?
Yes. When I said that there was less time to play golf, yes, I want to spend more time, especially with the children and grandchildren. And I do want to talk to them about God and try to get them away from this, I don't know. No one can know. No one can know answers to these questions. And my only question, well, some people have found answers. And my answers might not appeal to everyone, but they've appealed to me, and I think they can appeal to many others. I'm aware from my experience in economics that everyone comes from a different background. Everyone has different biases, different things that shape them, and not everyone looks at things in the same way. Things that I look at that say, wow, that's really persuasive, people have just dismissed out of hand. Because they come from a different background. So I'm not of the belief that everyone who reads the book is all of a sudden going to agree with me. But what I've done is I presented, hey, this is the way this has impacted me. And let me tell you in this final chapter of my book how it has changed my life. And it has changed my life in an absolutely amazing way, for which I am eternally grateful. And again, my only regret is, wouldn't it have been nice to have changed it in my 20s? So I could have avoided so many of those mistakes that everyone makes, and I made.
Yes, but those mistakes are, that's the education that we get that makes us quote unquote wiser as we get older. The pandemic changed everyone's lives, either some for good, most for bad, but that was global. How do you think the pandemic affected faith, the Christian movement, or any religious movement?
Yeah, religions as a whole and individually have been losing followers. And I think the COVID experience really accelerated that particular movement. Now, there are certain, as you say, there are certain churches that are gaining followers. And, my hope is that as a result of my book, people will look more favorably upon Christianity. And as a matter of fact, some of the nicest comments I've had are people from many different religions that have looked at Christianity a lot differently after reading the book. So, it's got to be an individual situation. We go through a period now when kids go to college, and college has always been a time when they lose their religion. They've left home, now they go to college, and the college teachers, who are so brilliant, tell them there is no God and it was just made up so that you would behave. And if you're really smart, you will just forget about God because he doesn't exist. That's what kids are told, right? I had nephews who were told that in grade school, that your parents don't know what they're talking about. And so the lack of God is very, very persuasive. And one of the reasons I titled a book, Is There Evidence for God?, is because my search was actually to try to find evidence for God. And it wasn't just evidence for a God. And frankly, I didn't care if there was a God, but he didn't care about us. He was just out there and existed and created the universe and then went home. That wasn't of interest to me. What I wanted to find out, I wanted to find out about God. I wanted evidence for God. What is he like? And I believe I found that.
Well, this is an amazing book for sure. I would highly recommend book clubs get together, pick this book up. Robert, do you do virtual or in-person speaking engagements?
Yes, I've done so many speeches as an economist. I am very excited now, more excited about doing speeches about God, what I've found and what other people have found. And so, yes, I'm open to all sorts of presentations. Would love to talk about the book. Would like to even go to bookstores to meet people. Maybe go to book clubs if there's a book club that has this book in it and wants to talk about it. I think that'd be great. I'd love to. We could do that either virtually or we could do that in person.
That's great. Book clubs do use Zoom into Books to meet authors that way. I have posted Robert's links to get in touch with him. His website is posted in the Facebook links. And this video will be available on our Facebook page from now until forever. And it will also be uploaded to our YouTube channel in a few weeks. So if you would like to get in touch with Robert, please go to his Facebook page. You can go to zoomintobooks.com and meet all the Zoom Into Books authors. Zoom Into Books is live streamed and for book clubs, to libraries, schools, any point where people are waiting, we try to put Zoom Into Books. So, Robert, as we are parting here, what do you hope your readers will take away from your book?
Very simply, that there is evidence for God. And it's evidence for a God who loves us and wants us to know him and love him.
That's the best message I will probably hear all year. So thank you very much for joining us on Zoom Into Books, Robert. And thank you everyone for watching on Facebook. And we appreciate your questions. You can still get in touch with Robert if you have other questions. And please join us again here on Zoom Into Books.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
Thank you.